Episode 3 Saunders Aircraft Limited starts in Montreal. Once Saunders Aircraft was incorporated and the financing in the bank, Dave Saunders quickly got down to work on the Heron ST-27 conversion. Saunders Aircraft rented a third-floor apartment in a plain 6-story brick building at 770 Lakeshore Drive, located 1.5 kilometers south of Dorval Airport in Montreal. This apartment became the head office for Saunders Aircraft operation with 5 staff on board: Dave Saunders, John Copeland as controller, Gail Goodwin as assistant to the president, Andre Belanger as chief draftsman, and Zeb. Stan. Zeb was a master sheet metal person. Show Stan a sketch and Zeb would make the part. Stan. Zeb worked with Dave Saunders at Aircraft Industries of Canada Limited and was recruited along with Joe Jackson and a few other people to come to Saunders Aircraft from Aircraft Industries of Canada. Saunders is planning that since the Havilland DH114 Heron is a British aircraft, the quickest way to modifying and certifying the ST-27 would be to have the certification process approved by the British Air Registration Board, ARB, and have the Canadian Department of Transport, DOT, kept in the certification loop. Since a large part of the Canadian aviation industry was owned by British firms, the liaison between the ARB and DOT was well established. The ARB would change its name to the Civil Aviation Authority, CA, in 1972. In this period following World War II, Transport Canada did not have a uniform set of Canadian aircraft certification standards to follow for Canadian aircraft manufacturers. The Canadian Air Transport Administration, CATA, a branch of the Department of Transport, allowed a Canadian manufacturer to use either the British Civil Airworthiness Requirements, CARS, or follow the USA Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, Federal Air Regulations, FARs. Since Saunders Aircraft was converting a British-built aircraft, the de Havilland DH114 Heron, Saunders chose to use the British BCAR requirements. The change from 4-piston engines to 2 larger turboprop engines and the fuselage stretch would require strengthening in certain areas. Saunders Aircraft contracts Aviation Traders Engineering Limited, or called ATEL, to perform the engineering analysis and design for the Heron to ST-27 conversion. ATEL would provide the engineering drawings. ATEL was located at Southend Airport, 55 kilometers southeast of London, UK. ATEL was also contracted to administer the Saunders ST-27 certification program with the British Air Registration Board, ARB. ATEL was a division of the parent firm, Aviation Traders Limited, ATEL. ATEL was set up after World War II by Sir Freddie Laker to buy, sell, and lease surplus World War II aircraft and parts into the civilian market. Aviation Traders Engineering Limited, ATEL, was set up in 1949 to provide engineering and manufacturing support to ATEL activities. In the 1950s, ATEL embarked on a new aircraft build, the ATEL 90 Accountant, with the aim to provide a new aircraft to replace the venerable Douglas DC-3 and to compete with the new Avro, Hawker Siddeley, HS-748. The Accountant would seat 28 passengers and was powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Dart turboprop engines. The Accountant first flew on July 9, 1957, but was not put into production. Despite the failure of the ATEL 90 to go into production, ATEL would continue converting existing aircraft for new purposes. Perhaps the most famous of ATEL's aircraft conversions would be the conversion of Douglas DC-4 transports into the ATEL 98 Carver. The ATEL 98 Carver was built in response to Freddie Laker's idea for an air ferry to transport passengers and their automobiles between the UK and continental Europe. In total, 21 Carvers were converted. The big nose would swing open and automobiles load into the aircraft via a scissor lift and flown across the English Channel. ATEL employed around 1,500 workers and had annual gross earning over £5.5 million British pounds. ATEL would start engineering work on the Saunders ST-27 late in 1968. Considering that the two companies were an ocean apart, the lines of communication would have been slow. Overseas phone calls required booking a time slot with the long-distance telephone operator for your long-distance call to the UK. A 3-minute call to London, UK would be around $12. In 1968, the one-way airfare from Montreal to London was $299 at the 21 days excursion rate. Since Saunders Aircraft was based in Canada, Saunders would inform the Canadian Department of Transport of the proposed Heron ST-27 project, and it seemed that the paperwork would flow from Saunders Aircraft to the Department of Transport, and the Department of Transport would coordinate with the British ARB. On July 15, 1968, DOT sent a letter to Mr. W. F. Morton, chief at the FAA New York Engineering Standards Branch Office, advising the FAA of the proposed Heron ST-27 conversion. The DOT letter outlines the project as such: the 4 Gypsy 30 engines would be replaced by 4 Allison 250 B-15 turboprop engines, the fuselage lengthened by 11 feet instead of 8 feet, and that the wingspan would be reduced by 10 feet. Different to what the ST-27 became, but perhaps the final design was not nailed down by ATEL. Also, in the above letter it seems that DOT is undecided whether the ST-27 would be certified to the USA FAA Federal Air Regulations, FAR, 23 or to the British Civil Air Regulations, BCAR, Section E. DOT would ask the FAA if there were any special conditions to certify an Heron Mk2 aircraft to the FAA FAR 23 requirements. The USA FAR 23 regulations dealt with commuter aircraft 12,500 pounds, and under the BCR regulations dealt with transport category aircraft. The British BCR requirement had a broader, transport aircraft, regulation that the ST-27 certification would meet, while the USA FAA had 2 distinct aircraft regulations governing commercial aircraft types. In 1968, the Federal Air Regulation, FAR 23 for commercial aircraft weighing 12,500 pounds or less and could only carry 19 passengers plus 2 crew. The second FAA Air Regulation was the more stringent FAR 25 for transport category aircraft weighing more than 12,500 pounds. FAR 25 had an emphasis on fail-safe design and features, namely the assurance of safety through the provision of redundancy. Should a part fail, another redundant part or backup feature is available to permit a safe ending to that flight. On August 1, 1968, Saunders Aircraft mails a $2,000 check to DOT as the initial payment of the ST-27 certification fee of $10,000, and that any fees incurred by the British ARB in the certification process would be paid by DOT out of the DOT $10,000 certification fee. Dave Saunders' ST-27 plan was that ATEL would fulfill the ST-27 design, engineering support and certification program requirements to meet the British government's Ministry of Civil Aviation aircraft regulations. Since the de Havilland Heron was designed and built in Britain, one could see that the Saunders approach to UK ST-27 certification was logical, plus ATEL probably could get easier access to the de Havilland Heron factory design data should it be needed for the ST-27 conversion and certification. Saunders believed this ATEL-ARB path would be the fastest way to get his Saunders Aircraft ST-27 type certified. Time was very important as other commuter-type aircraft were coming online. Saunders felt that once the ST-27 had the UK type certificate, it would be quickly accepted by the United States FAA and Canada's Department of Transport. These countries had bilateral aviation agreements on aircraft type certificates, provided the aircraft met their country's air regulations. Thus, Dave Saunders felt that the FAA and DOT would basically a rubber stamp certification approval for the ST-27 once the ST-27 UK type certificate was issued. To ensure that the ST-27 meet the requirements for the FAA commuter and transport aircraft categories, Saunders also directed ATEL to also engineer the ST-27 Heron conversion to the more rigid FAA FAR 25 regulation. While there were similarities between the two regulations, there were also differences such as the fail-safe structural design features in FAR 25 which the Heron aircraft never had. The Heron aircraft was designed using safe life principles where a part would be replaced when it reached its safe life limit, whereas fail-safe design ensured that a part would not fail to the point where the aircraft could not be landed safely. On September 17, 1968, DOT refunds Saunders Aircraft the $2,000 initial payment on the DOT certification fee for the ST-27. Since Saunders Aircraft and ATEL would apply for ARB certification, and that ATEL and ARB would handle the certification paperwork, and DOT felt they would have no involvement in the design approval of the project. On October 4, 1968, DOT advises W.F. Morton of the FAA New York office that Saunders Aircraft would carrying out the modification of the Heron ST-27 aircraft under the authority of the UK Air Registration Board. In turn, the Air Registration Board will request FAA special conditions from the FAA European office in Brussels, Belgium. Therefore, the DOT request for the FAA ST-27 special conditions is cancelled. The next step for Saunders Aircraft was to purchase a de Havilland Heron for conversion. Preliminary work such as removing the Gypsy engines could be done on the de Havilland Heron conversion, while ATEL was doing the engineering analysis and design. On January 17, 1969, Saunders bought de Havilland Heron No. 14059 from World Aviation Consultants for $1. Showing a sale price of $1 plus other valuable considerations is common practice in the aircraft industry to protect the confidentiality of the selling price. De Havilland Heron No. 14059 had a remarkably interesting history with the Royal Air Force, RAF. Heron 14059 was manufactured in 1955, was taken on strength by the Royal Air Force on May 19, 1955, and was given the RAF registration number XH375. Heron 14059 was operated by the Queen's Flight. The Queen's Flight was a unit of the RAF, and operated aircraft for the transport and use of the royal family. In the early 1960s, a near miss involving an aircraft of the Queen's Flight resulted in the aircraft being painted day-glow red. Heron 14059 still carried its day-glow red paint when Saunders Aircraft purchased it. Saunders employees would nickname Heron 14059 the Red Baron, and take delight in flying in the same aircraft as Queen Elizabeth II had flown in. Canadian newspapers reported in February 1969 that Saunders Aircraft had leased out the Duke's Heron 14059 on a short-term basis to National Aviation Consultants of Waterloo, Ontario for charter work. A few days later, on January 24, 1969, Saunders Aircraft closed a deal with Simber Air out of Sonneborg, Denmark, to purchase a de Havilland Heron, serial number 14058. Again, the bill of sale for Heron number 14058 would show the selling price as $1. However, the value shown on the customs form was $46,156. De Havilland Heron number 14058 also had a remarkable interesting history prior to being purchased by Saunders Aircraft. Heron number 14058 came off the de Havilland aircraft assembly line at Hatfield, Hertfordshire in 1954, was delivered to the Royal Air Force and given RAF registration XG603. XG603 was attached to the British Joint Services Mission in Washington, D.C. and outfitted with 8 executive seats. When the British Air Attaché was told that XG603 could only carry 8 passengers, he had a quick look inside the aircraft and suggests that this Heron might be all right for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Thus, Heron number 14058 XG603 was nicknamed Snow White. After serving the British ambassador in Washington and carrying notable passengers such as Lord Louis Mountbatten, XG603 was sent to the RAF Far East Air Force in 1966 and flew for the Air Attaché in Saigon, Vietnam, while the Vietnam War was on. Finally, in October of 1968, XG603 number 14058 was declared RAF surplus and was purchased by Hawker Siddeley Aviation and later Simba Air. The conversion of Heron number 14058 to a Saunders ST-27 began in February 1969. Saunders Aircraft rented out hangar space from Atlantic Aviation Services of Canada. The hangar was located on 595 Stuart Graham Boulevard at Dorval Airport at Montreal, Quebec. Montreal was a major Canadian aviation manufacturing hub. Canadian Vickers, later to be Canadair then Bombardier Aerospace Group, began in 1911. Fairchild Aircraft Canada started operations in the 1920s, and Nuardine Aircraft Limited began building their iconic Norseman aircraft in 1935. World War II would see Montreal's aviation industry expand greatly, and continue into the 1950s and 1960s. Saunders Aircraft found a big pool of aviation workers to hire locally and supplemented their hangar workforce by hiring workers from a UK-based aviation job shop called Modern Technical Services. Modern Technical Services were supplying workers to Canadair in Montreal, and when work slowed down at Canadair, a few workers from Modern Technical Services joined Saunders Aircraft. Atlantic Heron No. 14058 was rolled into Atlantic Aviation's hangar on February 5, 1969, and work commenced on stretching or extending the fuselage. A 5-foot 6-inch section was forward of the wing, and a 3-foot section added behind the wing. The added fuselage sections can be seen in green zinc chromate primer paint. The 4 Gypsy Queen engines were removed and the engines sold on the used aviation engine market. Temporary weights were hung from the nose to prevent the aircraft from tipping back because the weight of the Gypsy engines was removed. New fuselage skins in green primer paint were riveted to the new fuselage frames and stringers. Work on ST-27001/14058 progressed well, with employees putting in long hours, as Saunders had set a goal that the first ST-27 would fly by the end of May. On occasion, Dave Saunders would stop work and take the employees down to Tavern on the Green, a local pub near Dorval Airport, for an impromptu afternoon lunch and a few beers, with Dave Saunders picking up the lunch and bar tab. These pub lunches led by Dave Saunders kept morale high among the Saunders Aircraft staff. Pratt & Whitney Canada was located just southeast of Montreal at Longueuil, Quebec, which made obtaining the PT6-27 turboprop engines an easy cross-town pickup. Reg Kersey was brought into the company by Dave Saunders in early 1969. Saunders Aircraft needed a DOT-qualified and approved test pilot for the Saunders ST-27 certification program, and Kersey had the DOT qualifications and test pilot experience to fill the need. Reginald Reg Kersey was born on March 21, 1925, in Hampton, Ontario. Kersey enlisted in the RCAF and earned his pilot's wings. Kersey then went on to serve with the British Fleet Air Arm as a pilot officer. At the end of World War II, Kersey was discharged and enrolled in the Toronto Rehabilitation School to earn his senior matriculation, high school diploma. Once Kersey had his high school diploma, he enrolled in the University of Toronto and obtained his degree in aeronautical engineering in 1951. Upon graduation from university, Kersey rejoined the RCAF. The RCAF granted Kersey a coveted spot at British Empire Test Pilot School at Boscombe Down in Farnborough, England. Kersey would train to be a test pilot. After graduating from the British Empire Test Pilot School, Kersey returned to Canada, was involved in the development of the Avro Aero, and was the RCAF acceptance test pilot for the Avro CF-100 jet fighter. In 1966, Kersey developed a heart condition which limited any high-altitude flying, and Kersey left the RCAF. In 1966, Kersey formed an Ottawa-based company called Kersey Airspray Limited that was involved in aerial photographic surveys. Kersey then joined Canadian Aero Corporation/Surveyor as vice president. Canadian Aero Corporation was a Canadian subsidiary of the United States-based Aero Service Corporation, which in turn was a division of the large American defense contractor Litton Industries. Aero Services Corporation of the USA first started doing work in Canada with the aerial survey for the Alaska Highway in 1942. In the spring of 1950, Aero Services Corporation established Canadian Aero Services. Canadian Aero Serves would partner with Spartan Air Services on aerial mapping projects. Dave Saunders could have met Reg Kersey in the RCAF and then through the aerial photography and mapping industry, as Dave Saunders had designed special camera door with an optical glass window for a Lear 25 jet for use with Spartan Airways for an aerial survey project. Spartan Airways was also doing the flying portion of the aerial surveys, while Canadian Aero would do the data processing. The Canadian Aircraft Operator, a Canadian bi-monthly aviation trade newspaper, published a front-page article on the Saunders Heron conversion. The February 17, 1969 article was titled, PT6-Powered Heron Conversion Planned by New Montreal Firm. The article stated that the Heron conversion would feature a stretched fuselage and accommodate 24 passengers and 3 crew. The ferrying of the Herons to Montreal was being handled by National Aviation Consultants out of Breslau, Ontario. The mailing label affixed to this February 17 copy of Canadian Air Operator was addressed to Can-Aero Mineral Services, RR5, Ottawa, Ontario, the company where Reg Kersey was employed, so Kersey was aware of the Saunders Heron project. The Montreal Gazette daily newspaper interviewed Dave Saunders on March 15, 1969, and published a half-page story on Saunders Aircraft in the business section of the Gazette titled, "Aircraft Firm Looks to Commuter Market." Dave Saunders explained the Heron to ST-27 conversion program and said that the company was backed by a group of considerable financial resources that included the All-Canadian Venture Fund, Prudential Insurance, the Steinberg family, of the Steinberg grocery store chain, the firm Arbuckle, Govett and Company, fund managers, and the First National Bank of New York. Saunders stated that the investment group had acquired 55% of 690,000 common shares at $1.50 per share. That initial share sale amounted to $1,035,000, and those shares were being held in escrow pending a public offering in the next fall. Saunders said that the ST-27 will sell slightly more than $400,000, and they have one firm order from Simber Air in Denmark. Saunders had purchased Heron No. 14058 from Simber Air in January. Saunders also stated that a Canadian operator has interest in purchasing several ST-27s for service between points in Quebec and Ontario. Parallel ST-27 aircraft certifications will take place in Canada and the UK once the prototype flies in late May or early June. ST-27 certification proceedings should be over by December, and the aircraft should be in service by early next year, 1970. Saunders expected the Quebec government to provide grants to cover up to 50% of building the new aircraft assembly plant, but the Quebec government had their hands full with the Canadair CL-215 water bomber project. The Quebec government had agreed to cover 50% of the development and acquisitions costs of the CL-215 project, and the Canadian federal government the other 50% of the costs. The CL-215 was having major certification issues due to design issues. A meeting with DOT officials and Saunders Aircraft was held on March 27, 1969 to discuss the ST-27 certification program. Representing DOT were Walter McLeish, Kenneth Owen, E.P. Bridgeland, M.D. Jelinek, R.G. Gollinger, W. Baird, A.R. Baker, R.J. Polk, J. Bohe, J. Hamilton, D. Peck, W. Gadzos, and R.P. Bentham. Post-World War II, many Air Force veterans found their way into regulatory positions with DOT, as did Walter McLeish. Walter McLeish was the chief aeronautical engineer at Transport Canada. McLeish was a former RCAF pilot. McLeish flew the de Havilland Mosquito fighter bomber during World War II. After World War II, McLeish obtained his bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering from McGill University and his master's degree in aeronautical engineering from Michigan University. McLeish joined the Department of Transport in 1964 as the chief aeronautical engineer for the DOT Airworthiness and Aircraft Certification branch. Representing Saunders Aircraft at the DOT certification meeting was Saunders Company President, Dave Saunders, and newly hired Company Vice President Reg Kersey. Also in attendance was Brian Carey of ATEL. Brian Carey joined ATEL in October of 1956 and became chief aerodynamicist at ATEL in 1959 while working on the ATEL Carver project. Previously, Brian Carey had completed a 5-year apprenticeship at the UK aircraft firm Saunders Roe, no relation to Saunders Aircraft, from 1952 to 1955 while attending the University of Southampton, and graduated with honors in aeronautical engineering. A note of interest was that during World War II, Brian Carey at 7 years old and his elder sister were interred by the Japanese at the Chefoo and Wasian internment camp in China after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Carey's parents were British missionaries in China. Brian Carey and his sister would not reunite with their parents until December 1945. The story of British civilians in Japanese internment camps was brought to the movie screen in 1987 in the Steven Spielberg movie, Empire of the Sun, based on the same titled semi-autobiographical novel by J.G. Ballard. Work continued steadily on the first ST-27 in the Atlantic Aviation hangar. Some sheet metal parts were modified in the hangar to fit the conversion, and the drafting department had to make drawing changes to reflect what was done in the hangar and vice versa. Dave Saunders filled out the DOT paperwork for the registration of the ST-27001-14058 on May 15. ST-27001-14058 would be given the registration CFYBM. Listed on the DOT registration application form were the following company officers: Dave Saunders as President, J.G. Copeland as Vice President, Walter Hood from Hood Securities as Secretary-Treasurer. Listed as directors were Reg Kersey from Canadian Aero Services, J.R. Conacher from Woodgundy Securities, R.M. Mee from International Trust, and Steve Causer from Capital Management. On May 21, 1969, the weight and balance procedures were done on the completed ST-27. Transport Canada wrote W.F. Morton of the FAA on May 20 enclosing 3 copies of FAA Form 312 application for aircraft certification for the Saunders Aircraft ST-27. Transport Canada proposed that the Canadian certification would be to FAR 23 dated February 1, 1965, plus FAA Amendments 23-1 to 23-6 inclusive and Special FAR No. 23 as published in the U.S. Federal Register on January 1969. Transport Canada asked if there were any special conditions which the FAA would require the ST-27 aircraft to comply with prior to awarding a FAA type certificate. Dave Saunders planned an official ST-27 unveiling, so Saunders Aircraft mailed out formal invitations for a reception to present the Saunders ST-27 aircraft to the public. The champagne party was held on May 23, from 4 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. at the Atlantic Aviation Reception Lounge at 10105 Atlantic Avenue at Dorval Airport. During the party, a miscue occurred when the wife of one of the Saunders major investors, it may have been Mrs. Steinberg, dented the nose cone of the brand-new ST-27 with a champagne bottle during an ill-thought-of attempt to christen the new ST-27, same as the old naval tradition, by breaking a bottle of champagne on the ship's bow. Saunders Aircraft Chief Inspector, A.M.E. K.C. Butler, certified that he inspected this ST-27001 aircraft, especially the flying and operating controls for correct operation and the presence of all safety and locking devices, and the aircraft is serviceable. Major work listed included the rear fuselage extension, front fuselage extension, reinforcement of the cockpit roof, installation of the front starboard door, enlargement of the cockpit door opening, rework of the center main spar, replacement of the fabric on the elevators, removal of the outboard engines and rework of the leading edge sheet metal in that engine area, installation of the PT-6-27 engines, reinforcement of the engine mount and brackets, and rework of the cowls and engine fairings, electrical work relation to the turboprop engines, installation of an undercarriage warning horn, installation of dual electrically driven air compressors for the pneumatic brakes. Saunders Aircraft applied for a DOT flight permit on May 27. Henry Roussel, Regional Superintendent of Air Regulation for the DOT Quebec office, sent the approved the flight permit and aircraft registration to Saunders Aircraft with the following conditions. 1. Daylight hours VFR, visual flight rules only. 2. Essential crew only, no passengers. 3. Flight over built-up areas prohibited except for takeoffs and landings. 4. Aircraft to be certified as serviceable in aircraft journey logs by a qualified AME immediately prior to flight. 5. Landing gear shall be locked in the down position for the entire flight. 6. Letter X to be appended to the aircraft registration number. DOT inspectors inspected the ST-27001 on May 27 and found 29 airframe and 21 electrical items that need to be addressed before the maiden flight, which Saunders Aircraft personnel immediately fixed. On May 28 at 7 a.m. the first Saunders ST-27 took to the skies with Dave Saunders or Reg Kersey at the controls. Brian Carey took the in-flight photographs from the Red Baron Heron chase plane. The first flight of ST-27001 was a success. Subsequent flights were put on ST-27001, including flights with the landing gear retracted. Atlantic Aviation wanted their leased hangar space back, and Saunders Aircraft was waiting to lease hangar space in a new hangar that was under construction at Dorval. Therefore, the Saunders Aircraft operation in June 1969 temporarily located to Ottawa, Ontario, to a hangar at 260 Hunts Club Road at Uplands Airport, or now known as Ottawa International Airport.
This has been a KPK Air 18 video. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.